The Australian Public Service, or the APS as I'll call it, is meant to be apolitical, serving not only the government, but also the Parliament and the Australian public. The High Court has further found that, and I quote, "The maintenance and protection of an apolitical and professional public service is a significant purpose consistent with the system of representative and responsible government mandated by the Constitution." Now, since its inception, the public service has been charged with two main functions. First, it is, or these days at least it's expected to be, the principal source of independent expert advice. I emphasise independent expert advice that the government can call upon when developing its policies. And second, the public service carries the main responsibility for the implementation of government programs. In discussing these two main functions, I will focus on what they imply for the accountability of both the government and the public service itself to the Parliament, and through the Parliament to the community at large. Before proceeding further, however, I want to acknowledge that I am not an inside observer of today's public service. As you just heard, I left more than 20 years ago. Nevertheless, there seems to me to be enough on the public record to allow us to reach some judgments. So I'll start with policy development. At the outset, it's important to recognise that in our system of government, it is the elected government of the day that takes the policy decisions and is accountable for those decisions, not the public servants. Public servants can provide useful public information as background to a policy decision, but precisely because public servants are meant to be independent and non-partisan, they will be properly cautious about publicly debating the merits of policy decisions. Instead, advocacy of government policy is best left to the responsible minister. This is critical if the independence of the public service is to be maintained and is able to equally serve an alternative government following an election. However, while serving the government of the day, I think those public servants involved in policy development need to ensure that their advice has due regard to the values of that government. This means, for example, that economic advice from the public service about the best way to reduce the budget deficit should not argue for a tax increase if the government was elected on a promise to lower taxes. Instead, in that case, the advice should identify opportunities for savings in program expenditures or tax concessions, with the final decisions being dependent on ministers' value judgments. But more often, frankly, public service advisors do not need to change the substance of their advice. Frequently, it's more a matter of how the advice is given. Public servants need to be aware of their minister's frame of reference and present their advice accordingly, so that the minister can readily relate to it. That approach to presenting advice can make all the difference between acceptance and rejection. In short, public service policy advisors do need to win the trust of the government of the day. Without that trust, it's much less likely that public servants will be listened to, let alone effective. But if that trust is established and maintained, then in my experience, the ministers that I worked with, and they were from both major political parties, these ministers did value frank and fearless advice. Ministers usually appreciate that public servants have a degree of expertise in their policy area, based especially on their research, contacts and knowledge of client needs, and what has worked well and what has not worked in the past. To sum up my argument to this point, I believe that when governments are working well, there is a creative partnership between that government and the public service. For example, many of the very productive economic and social welfare reforms during the 1980s and 1990s were initially proposed by public servants, and the public servants worked in close contact with ministers in developing the details of all these reforms. Equally, however, there's no question that ministers led and directed the reform process and were responsible for all the decisions finally taken, as they should in a democracy. So let's now turn to the APS as it is today and policy development. The most recent comprehensive review of the APS is the Thodey Review, and that review affirmed that, and I quote, "The basic role of the APS is to provide robust and evidence-based advice to ministers frankly and freely." However, the Thodey Review found that APS capability has declined in critical areas, including strategic policy skills, and that APS in-house research and evaluation capabilities and processes have fallen. End quote. Significantly, the Thodey Review also found that APS research and evaluation is inhibited because, and I quote again, "departments and agencies are often more concerned with reputational risk, seeking to preempt or divert criticism, rather than learning from experience and feedback." End quote. And I would add that this public service concern for reputational risk has led in modern times to much greater efforts to frustrate requests under freedom of information. Other informed critics have come to similar conclusions about the loss of public service capability and openness. For example, Laura Tingle, in her 2015 quarterly essay, quotes Ken Henry, a former Treasury Secretary, as saying that, and I quote, "I think many departments have lost their capacity to develop policy, and I seriously doubt there is any serious policy development going on in most government departments." End quote. While Tingle also quotes Martin Parkinson, who was then head of the APS, as saying that, and I quote, "there is a decline in the quality of advice and an erosion of capability to the detriment of good government." End quote. In my view, however, there's little reason to hope that the role and capability of the public service to provide policy advice will improve in the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, the Morrison government rejected all the recommendations from the Thodey Review that would have helped restore that capability. Thus, the government rejected the recommendations that would have first restored the very successful past practices guiding public service research, evaluation and budgeting. Second, it rejected the recommendations that would have improved the accountability of ministerial staff, who these days frequently supplant public service advice, while neither they nor their minister are accountable to the Parliament for these ministerial advisors' actions. And third, the government rejected the recommendations that would have introduced a more robust and transparent process governing the appointment and termination of departmental secretaries. Instead, concerns will continue that the present process for the appointment and termination of secretaries does not follow due process and can reflect political patronage and political loyalty. Many fear that this denial of due process has damaged the ability and willingness of public servants to speak truth to power for fear of losing their jobs. However, we probably should not be surprised that the government sees no need for reform. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, made it clear that he does not see a role for the public service in policy development. Instead, Morrison has stated that he wants, and I quote, "a public service that is very focused on implementation." Accordingly, Morrison considers that, and I quote again, "guided by clear direction from ministers, the public service is at its best when it's getting on with the job of delivering services Australians rely on and ensuring governments can implement the policies that they have been elected to deliver for the Australian people." End quote. So with that admonition that the public services are mainly or even solely focused on policy implementation, let's turn to the role of the APS in policy implementation. When implementing government policy, APS employees are bound by the APS Code of Conduct. This requires the APS employees involved in administering the program to comply with all applicable Australian laws, including most obviously any laws specifying the operation of that program. Thus, for most programs, the legislation will specify, and sometimes quite tightly, how their appropriation must be spent. Other relevant requirements of the Code of Conduct are that APS employees must behave honestly and with integrity and act with care and diligence. In addition, when administering public monies, the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act says that any expenditure of public money should not be approved unless the administrator is satisfied that the expenditure will be efficient, effective, economical, and ethical. Similarly, those administering grants from government departments are bound by the Commonwealth grant rules and guidelines, which require, inter alia, that any such program must establish criteria which will allow a fair assessment of the eligibility and relative merit to determine whether a grant should be paid. Normally, this merit assessment would be made by public servants in writing. Under the rules, ministers are supposed to only overturn this assessment if he or she obtains evidence in support of that decision and explains in writing the reasons for overturning the departmental advice. The rules also say that ministers must report all such instances to the Finance Minister annually, giving the reasons for their approval of each grant. Incidentally, however, these rules and guidelines do not apply to the grants being administered by some statutory bodies such as Sports Australia. But in response to a recommendation by the Auditor-General, the Morrison government has now agreed that they will apply in such cases in the future. In principle, it therefore seems to me the framework is in place to ensure that public servants perform their tasks in implementing government policies ethically and with integrity. However, in both the case of the sports grants and more recently grants from the Safer Communities Funds, it would appear that the rules were not followed and that ministerial intervention remains unexplained and unjustified. It's true that the Audit Office did highlight the allocation of the sports grants, that the allocation of sports grants does not follow proper procedure. But can we rely on that? No such inquiry has yet exposed the rule breaking in the case of Safer Communities grants, although as recently as yesterday, the Auditor-General did announce that he proposed to audit that program's administration. But the relevant Minister, Dutton, has moved on. And in any case, is the risk of a critical audit report sufficient to ensure that the rules covering the allocation of grants monies are properly enforced? Or instead, should the rules be reinforced by requiring relevant ministers to, first, publicly release in advance the criteria that will be used to determine the eligibility and relative merit for all program grants, before calling for applications, and second, should ministers report all instances of their ministerial intervention to change the recommended allocation of program grants to the Parliament with a statement of the minister's reasons in each case and within 6 months of any such intervention. But beyond the administration of program grants, there are several other aspects of public service administration, especially recently and mostly relating to program performance, where I think a lot of people have legitimate concerns about how well accountability is working in practice. First, there is the reason of how willing the government and the public service are to provide information. Frankly, good policy depends upon the public being informed. Without such information about how government policies are working and are expected to work, it is more difficult to identify where policy changes are needed and to gain public acceptance for those changes. Excuse me. Support for the economic and social reforms in the 1980s and 1990s, for example, was built by making as much information available publicly as possible. That way, the public could see the need to reform and how the reforms would work to achieve their objectives. But today, that sort of information is eschewed. Instead, we have sterile arguments marked by an absence of evidence. Think of the past debate around climate change, for example. Equally important, today much less information is available about program performance and evaluation. And many departments are less willing to engage in public discussion with interested parties than in the past. In my view, this loss of evidence about program performance and discussion must come at a detriment to good policy development by the government, and I suspect its departmental advisors are unwilling to obtain evidence and engage is because they see such information as potentially embarrassing and/or an inconvenient limitation on their freedom of decision making. In my experience, however, if the public service is to fulfil its mandate as an independent source of expert advice in the pursuit of good policy outcomes, then the public service can and should be on the front foot in finding ways to make as much relevant information as possible publicly available. Second, the public service also holds a wealth of information about individual citizens. In my view, there should be a presumption in favour of allowing each citizen access to the information relating to them and their family. Indeed, I recall when freedom of information was first introduced, the decision was made by the heads of departments of the Departments of Social Security and Employment to give pensioners and job seekers, respectively, ready access to their personal files without having to go through the sometimes demanding procedures under freedom of information. Now, I was head of the Employment Department at that time, and I can vouch that the fairness of administration of job seekers' claims for assistance improved materially as a result of that access. By contrast today, I think that too often the requirements of freedom of information are used to frustrate the applicants seeking that information. For example, in relation to migration and visa claims, some information such as security clearance material could be appropriately withheld. However, I fear that too often other information, such as how a decision maker came to their conclusion that a relationship was non-genuine, is also being withheld. I want to add, however, that I think any concern with policy implementation and the provision of information should not be directed at the middle-level public servants who undertake the day-to-day duties of program administration. Rather, where there are faults in program administration, it usually reflects faults in program design and/or decisions made higher up. For an example, think of robo-debt, where any serious thought would have warned against relying on tax records to establish the current income of unemployed people. The administration of migration is another example of poor implementation, where the lengthening queue of contested visa claims is of itself encouraging the people smugglers. In both these examples, the critical decisions would have involved ministers, but it must be questioned how good was the advice. And did the advice fail to warn about the dangers of maintaining present policy arrangements, dangers that risk the government's own longer-term policy objectives? That brings me to my third concern about today's public service. I wonder if some of those at the top adequately pursue their duty to ensure administrative integrity. For example, the allocation of both the recent Sports and Safer Communities grants raises questions about the public service as well as the ministers. On the evidence, the public servants failed to establish the legal authority for the minister to take over the distribution of the sports grants. I also think the public servants should have insisted on warning both ministers of the need to establish and document their reasons for any changes in the recommended distribution of the grants and their eligibility. And finally, I strongly suspect that the report by the head of the APS into the sports rules failed to raise, let alone answer, some of these key questions. And I cannot reconcile his reported evidence that was used to acquit the minister of the most serious charge with the evidence cited by the Auditor General. Frankly, there's a conflict there, which is inexplicable. But we cannot know for sure what is in that report by the head of the APS, so long as the government relies on the pathetic excuse that it's a cabinet document. What worries me about these recent events involving public service integrity is that leadership did not seem to insist on due process being followed as laid down in the law. Instead, in the absence of penalties for flouting the relevant laws, public service leaders too often seem to feel that they need to prove their loyalty and that their first duty is to protect their government. I worry when this comes at a cost to integrity, especially as it is these most senior people who should lead by example and who are responsible for defining the culture of their organisation. To sum up, in my opinion, public servants do need to be responsive to the government of the day. In our democracy, governments are elected to govern and are held accountable at elections. And if the public servants are to win the government's trust and be effective, their advice needs to be responsive to the government's values, priorities, and announced policies. But equally, if public servants are going to add value to policy development, they must take advantage of their expertise and knowledge and give their honest advice frankly and fearlessly. It's a question of finding the right balance between responsiveness and independent expertise, and understanding the most effective way to present your case, given the minister's frame of reference. Because of this difficult balancing act, however, the role of the public service in relation to integrity is somewhat different from some of the other agencies being considered by this forum, such as the Judiciary, the Parliament, the Ombudsman, and the Auditor General. Each of these bodies exists to uphold the law and/or to hold the government to account. They effectively serve only one master. However, while the public service is bound to uphold the law and is also bound by its code of conduct, the public service is also part of executive government. But that said, I also think that public service should be on the front foot, seeking to improve the integrity of public administration wherever it can. Public servants should be on the lookout for ways to release more and better information and improve public accountability. We know that public understanding, based on good information, is critical to good government and good policy development and implementation. And I like to think this is the key reason why most of us opted to join the APS in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and it's wonderful to hear directly from someone who's been involved in the public service for so long about how integrity can be improved and the important role of the public service in balancing those different functions, which I think is a good point. We're now going to hear from Bret Walker, who needs a little introduction. Bret's a leading barrister. He's recently been a Royal Commissioner in South Australia and New South Wales, and has acted in many high profile cases. I'll pass over to Bret and then we'll go to questions. Thanks, Bret.
Thank you all very much. I can't possibly be as comprehensive in my view of these topics as Mike Keating, whom we're all very privileged to have just heard. His experience spans fields and periods that we would be very foolish not to pay very close regard to. I have experiences which are perhaps far more pinpoints rather than the broad perspective than Mike has brought. But as Hans mentioned, they include both work as an advocate, particularly for present purposes, in constitutional cases concerning the accountability for expenditures by government, and also as a Royal Commissioner and a Special Inquiry Commissioner, recently with the Murray-Darling and the Ruby Princess. You won't be surprised to know when I mention the Murray-Darling and the Ruby Princess then that in my experience and on reflection of the topics Han has asked me to consider, it is the provision of information of a kind which is critical for appropriate political discussion, which in turn is fundamental to the making of proper electoral choices, that seems to me to go to the heart of the matter. It seems to me also, for many of the reasons that Mike has just flagged, to highlight that there may well be structural, and certainly in my view there are moral deficiencies in the Australian public service as it operates today to bring about those happy conclusions. Can I explain? Constitutionally, it seems to me that that rare beast and implied freedom in the Australian Constitution of political communication is one which is produced because of the intolerable proposition that executive power could be possibly exercised, let alone with legislative authority, to deny people information which may lead to adverse judgments about those currently wielding executive power and commanding a majority in the legislature. That is nothing other than a form of elective tyranny, and those words should not be regarded as rhetorical exaggeration. That describes a state of affairs under so-called democratic governments, probably as to a majority of them for the last 250 years. I would like to believe, I do believe, that we do not belong to that category, but it is a complacency of a kind that is culturally deficient of us not to recognise that we are in danger of approaching that change. Constitutionally, it seems to me that if one took that bare bones and unattractive, if accurate, view of government, that it is a social compact to raise taxes and to spend money, then it ought to be critical at the level of the public service, the senior as well as the middle managers, always to have, probably literally on their desks or their screens, a reference to the statutory provision, including any delegated legislation and lawful directions, which govern whether money can be spent and how it may be spent. Furthermore, that ought to be recorded because it is the essence of civilised government with the rule of law and judicial review of administrative action, that there will always be evidence created. In other words, the same requirement at the public service level as the law has for long required with respect to private corporations. Proper records must be kept in order to understand the activities of the entity enjoying, in the case of corporations, limited liability, in the case of government, executive power over citizens and residents. That seems to me to be, in the case of what I won't hesitate to call the scandals that Mike has referred to with respect to certain grants programs, that seems to me to be a beginning of a very robust condemnation that has been expressed by some, but not by enough, and not by those in high places. How can there be obscurity about who authorises expenditure? How can there be obscurity about what head of power, ultimately emanating from a statute, not from some woolly abstraction invented and coached into power by Sir Robert Garran's delusions about the executive power, but rather a black and white prescription and proscription on what may be spent and what may not be spent, what conditions must exist and what conditions preclude expenditure. That ought to be a matter of reaching for the filing cabinet, digital or documentary, in a way that would take minutes, not weeks, that would take no extra money in terms of expenditure under FOI compared to the salaries of those who, after all, are paid to administer executive government. I'm very troubled by the notion that expenditure can be calculated so as, in many cases, to provide a monstrous impediment to freedom of information. I do not understand why it is not regarded as part and parcel of the expenditure necessary to have a public service, that is, to administer the executive power of the Commonwealth, that there will be, as a standing part of the duties of the office of people in appropriate positions, that they will devote such time and resources to making searches as are reasonable. Of course, there can be provision for extreme requests of a kind all of us who've ever had anything to do with FII will have experienced from time to time. But as so often, the proper rules should not be distorted by consideration of extremes which are both bizarre and a tiny minority of experience. It does seem to me, therefore, that the APS values, which sit on top, so to speak, of the APS Code of Conduct, both of which are, if I may say so, with intended scorn, smack of whiteboard products generated ultimately from the far more savage Public Service Act and Public Service Regulations, that they now seem to me to present a real challenge of credibility, calling for real doubt as to the seriousness of attachment to them, that is, the values and the Code of Conduct, by those who are supposedly in charge of the APS. I say supposedly because my suspicion is that recent events demonstrate that ministerial preference, predilection, or whim are much more important than the supposedly fearless espousal and exercise of values and duties and powers by those who are professionally at the head of the public service. Let me explain. We're told that one of the APS values is that the public service will be accountable. That is, it will be open and accountable to the Australian community. In my view, that is now nothing but a whited sepulchre. Those are pretty words to describe something that has no correspondence to reality. And it can be seen that it is not just the conduct of public servants, but also how they are understandably intimidated by the law into producing something which is not open and therefore denies accountability. Mind you, even at the high sloganesque level of the APS values, one will find that that accountability is said to be within the framework of ministerial responsibility. And that leads me to this observation about ministerial responsibility. I'm glad I live in a country with responsible government compared to the United States of America, where the president is not responsible to Congress in the same way that the Prime Minister and the ministers are responsible to the House of Representatives in our country. If it leads, in our case, to less stability of government, to the horror of the late 18th century devices of the American Constitution, then it turns out that that is all for the good. That is accountability through the people's representatives. But it does seem to me that it is of the essence, as the High Court plainly recognised in producing the implied freedom of political communication, that ministerial responsibility of that kind through the House of Representatives and through the House of Representatives to the electors can only have any real meaning if there is information available and discussion permitted, discussion including what is sometimes called dissent, that is disagreement with or frank disapproval of the current government. There cannot be any serious freedom of political communication, and therefore there cannot be ultimate dominion by sovereignty by the electors unless there is information available and discussion meaningfully permitted, including by way of dissent, concerning the doings of the government. And the current government should never feel paranoid, as I fear some current occupants of ministerial office demonstrate almost weekly in their comments, about the fact that the press or the people are intent on criticism. The exercise of power is always best cabined in by the unfriendly commentary of those who don't like what's happening. The notion that you could possibly seriously suggest that as a minister you are entitled to receive only cheers and applause compared to boos and criticism need only be stated to be rejected, but I fear in modern Australia needs to be repeated. The events of the last couple of weeks would rather suggest that there is a sensitivity to criticism at the level of the highest ministerial officers in the Commonwealth, which is utterly inimical to the freedom of political communication. And I doubt if that had been a legislative program as opposed to a judicial understanding of the structure of our Constitution, I doubt whether many governments over the last 20 years would ever have legislated for such an implied freedom. And that, I think, is a terrible indictment upon a huge split, a gap, a division between those exercising executive power at the highest level and the people whose sovereignty is meant to be exhibited by that delegated exercise of executive power. Of course, the Code of Conduct descends a little closer to the daily conduct of the public service work and has less of the sloganesque content. That's a pity, because what I've called sloganesque, of course, is another word for describing at a high level of abstraction worthy ideals that ought in fact guide daily conduct. But it is to be recalled the Code of Conduct in several places emphasises the need for what is called confidentiality. Interestingly, when you actually come to the hard-edged black letter law regulating access to information that public servants have, the Public Service Regulations, Regulation 2.1, authorised by Section 13 of the Act, makes it clear that confidentiality, in fact, goes beyond the ordinary legal concept of confidentiality. Furthermore, we have Section 70 of the Crimes Act, which is expressed in terms so broad as, I think, largely never to be applied. That is, if every suspected instance of a breach of Section 70 had been prosecuted from 1901 onwards, we'd still be hearing cases from before the war. Section 70 makes it an offence for an APS employee to publish or communicate. The distinction is interesting because this does not involve simply broadcasting. It means telling anyone to publish or communicate a fact that came to his or her knowledge by virtue of being a Commonwealth officer. And then the words which save that from being out and out tyranny, and which it is the employee's duty not to disclose. And there's the nub of it. We have in our legal system, under standards which are very rarely prosecuted, but which stay as an intimidatory cloak over the conduct of our public servants, we have laws which presuppose a duty not to disclose, which experience shows extends far beyond national security matters, far beyond legal professional privilege in current litigation, and far beyond matters which, if revealed, would work an unhealthy effect on public markets. Thus, for example, the devising of a budget being kept highly secret in order not to work distortions in, for example, the market for publicly traded securities. among others. In short, we have a system which sets as its default approach to access to information about government that the people can't have it. And it does seem to me that the most disappointing and disappointed statement of legislative intent in my lifetime has been the provision of the Freedom of Information Act, that having regulated the supposed rights to obtain information, was at pains to point out that the limits of obligation to provide ought not to be read as a limit on the power to provide. So the original FOI Act distinguished between an enforceable obligation on the part of government to produce information, to divulge information, and the power of government to do it, obviously in the public interest. That seems to me to have been totally lost sight of, and is a particular aspect of a malaise which, in my opinion, is getting worse, not better, and will not change unless there is by electors, not by judges, and not by public servants, by electors, a determination no longer to be told by those who wrongly consider they are our betters that they are better equipped to keep information about their doings than we are to know them. Thank you. Thanks,
Thanks
Al.
so much, Bret. I appreciate that, and lots of interesting food for thought there. I'll now go to questions from the audience. One of the audience members has asked, what do you both think of amending sections 10 and 13 of the Code of Values of the Public Service Act to explicitly forbid lying on official business in internal briefings?
To officially forbid what, sir?
Lying on official business in internal briefings.
Mike, can I go first?
Yeah, by all means.
The question cuts to the heart of matters, but is very startling. Imagine that we've actually reached a state of affairs where you can contemplate needing a specific law to forbid officers of the public service from lying about anything, frankly. How disgraceful. Of course, public servants should not lie, either to the members of the public, to each other, on committees, and certainly not to ministers. In some ways, the common law offence of misfeasance in a public office at an appropriately senior level of the Australian public service already criminalises that. I, of course, strongly endorse the notion that there needs to be explicit outlawing of deception and fraud in all aspects of the government. But I have to confess, if only rhetorically and as a matter of ideology, I am really appalled at the idea that we would need a law specifically to say so. Doesn't mean I would oppose it being legislated.
I'll just add to that. I don't see lying by public servants, not in my experience, as being a problem. I think the problem is more likely where they fail to provide information rather than lie about it.
Thanks, Mike. A related question to that from one of our board members, Stephen Charles, which is around, which is for Bret, looking at the failure of public servants to attend Royal Commission hearings. And Stephen spoke about the examples in the Ruby Princess inquiry where federal officials weren't being able to be called due to state instrumentality as a reason. Bret, do you think that the reason around state instrumentality is valid in that case? And how do we get federal public servants forward as witnesses in such inquiries?
No, I don't think the position taken by the Commonwealth is correct at several levels. I don't think it's legally correct. I think it's constitutionally both wrong and dangerous. I think it's socially divisive and intended to be, and all the worse for that. And I think ultimately, for the reasons that Mike has touched upon, it deprives serious mechanisms of accountability and policy formation of material which is in the public interest, unequivocally in the public interest, to have open and to have tested. It is against, probably unequivocally, against the instant political interest of certain governments in the sense of parties in power, that there be the availability of such information, let alone it being tested. But that, I would have thought, rather indicates how strongly it is in the public interest. But my experience in both Murray-Darling and Ruby Princess led me to record both in Murray-Darling in an appendix, and in Ruby Princess by what might be called a rude footnote, my strong deprecation of the position taken by the Commonwealth. Now, in Ruby Princess, I made the point of pointing out that when eventually the Commonwealth participated in that inquiry, through its lawyers, they did a splendid job. Interestingly, of course, it was a job that was very obscure. Why quarantine ought to be an obscure exercise between the Commonwealth and the States remains a really important question, literally topical, literally today. And for all those reasons, I could never understand why one wouldn't want all of this to come out. I do stress, eventually the Commonwealth was extremely well served by its lawyers. But in terms of its ministers and its senior public servants in relation to the Ruby Princess, and certainly in relation to the Murray-Darling, that they were very shabbily treated in terms of the public good that can come from proper consideration, including by testing of matters which in Murray-Darling had to do with science, and in Ruby Princess had to do with public health, matters which are not the subject of simple tabloid assertion, counter-assertion, matters which called in a really serious consideration of very respectable experts. And the Commonwealth in both cases, subject only to the splendid exception of their lawyers in Ruby Princess, that the Commonwealth deliberately went out of its way to deny to a state information about programs that explicitly, not implicitly, explicitly involve state-Commonwealth cooperation. It is absurd, and in my view, no law change is necessary. I think the provisions of the Service and Execution of Process Act, a Commonwealth statute, already make that clear. And it's a pity that it hasn't yet been litigated. Third time lucky, perhaps. I was sued once in the High Court, threatened a second time, maybe a third time. There'll be time for it actually to happen.
Thanks, Brett. Did you want to add anything to that, Mike?
No.
No, great. Move on. There's a question here for you, Mike. It says, you discussed the public service formal and emergent conduct, as well as risks to careers and reputation of the agency. What additional legal, operational and organisational checks and balances would you recommend to improve things?
I've recommended in relation to grants, improve, requirements to improve information. I think beyond that, there's a question about how much difference the public service can make in the face of government intransigence, and I guess that's why Bret Walker is suggesting that maybe the solutions lie with the electorate. But my own view is that it's possible, I don't know enough to say more than that, but it's possible that public servants have insufficient security of tenure now. The procedures for appointing and dismissing secretaries really are unsatisfactory. It's not a merit-based process. And the public servants would be more on the front foot, as I think they used to be when they felt more secure, in insisting on the requirements to follow due process as laid down in the law often.
Thank you, Mike. We've got a question here about parliamentary scrutiny. Does the panel agree that Parliament has lost oversight capability over the executive arm of government over the past 40 years? And if so, what might be done to recover that oversight and scrutiny to ensure better behaviour by executive and its agents, i.e. the public service?
Can I start on that?
Oh.
In some ways, I think parliamentary oversight's improved. I don't mean recently, but the committee system in the Senate started, I think, around the time of the Whitlam government, and I think parliamentary oversight was improved by that. I think that the problems for Parliament at the moment is the lack of information that the government is prepared to provide. Even where they don't, I think generally they've closed down, but they don't even follow the requirements of law in terms of ministers' obligations to report. So that's why I'm suggesting tightening the requirements of law. But I think the main thing is that the Parliament needs to demand much more information, which at present, it's got to the point where it's not even collected. The data on program evaluation performance isn't even collected now. Or if it is, it's contracted out to some consultancy firm who cooks the books, so to speak.
This is a topic of some professional interest of mine, because I've advised various houses of various parliaments over the years concerning the extent of their powers, that is enforceable powers, in terms of compelling information. And I think that if you took the last 40 years, as the question suggests, like Mike, I see a really marked, historically obvious improvement in the position. The blocks and delinquencies on the part of the executive that Mike has referred to, in fact, have only shown up in relief because of the huge strengthening of the committee system, particularly in the Senate, obviously. Joint committees, an Australian statutory initiative on various topics, have also turned out to be, perhaps to some people's surprise, a very promising, not yet fully realised mechanism for the obtaining of information by way of calling the executive to account. So it's not all bad news. That is, I don't think Mike and I are alone in the desert bewailing a state of affairs. Lots of people preceding and accompanying us have taken similar views, and some of them have been in a position really usefully to enhance the committee system. So don't despair. However, I think over the last 4 or 5 years, there has grown up a recalcitrance which is entirely contrary to the public interest on the part of ministers, and then I'm much regret to say reflected by some very senior public servants who, not with respect to policy, but with respect to administration and quittance, program quittance. How do you acquit yourself as to what you're asked to do with the program? How do you know whether you've done it? More to the point, how do the people and their representatives in the Senate know whether you've done it without the provision of information? Personally, and none of my parliamentary clients should take this as anticipatory advice, personally, my view is it's time actually to have a power struggle of a kind that the so-called separation of powers contemplates. It's probably time for there to be a vote on one of these committees for a report to the House, that is the Senate, for a resolution to punish people who do not answer questions or supply information.
Thank you, Bret. I guess linked to the provision of information is the issue of contractors and the outsourcing of the public sector. There's a question from the audience around how does this massive outsourcing of the public service impact transparency and accountability and the provision of information, and particularly around how contracts are awarded and and what information is available to the public on that. Do you want to go first, Mike?
Okay. Look, I think the contracting out, the first thing it's done is it's reduced, if not totally destroyed, the actual capacity of the public service itself. It no longer has the capability to seriously examine and evaluate programs and contracts it out. So we've got a loss of public service capability. And the second thing is that the contracts tend to be awarded on the basis that a contractor, when they bid for when they get a contract, their number one objective is to get another contract. And the best way to get another contract is to tell the client what they want to hear. So we've got a situation where the public service capability has been massively reduced, if not destroyed, and the contractors have a different objective function. And thirdly, the contractors themselves are often not very good. They don't have the capacity that the public service used to have. There's not the same review in contract firms. The contract firms really don't have the sort of quality control and peer review that the public service used to have. So I think this is a huge problem. It needs to be reversed.
I strongly agree. The Auditor General and all such public offices, of which the Auditor General is the paradigm, that seems to me to be a keystone of safeguards with respect to public service accountability, which is truly governmental accountability, of course. Do any of us really think we would contract out the position of the Auditor General? And if not, why not? I don't think anyone serious would seriously think that you would contract out the Auditor General, but you would provide, as we do, a very strong independence. Also, of course, you would provide appropriate resources, which we don't. But if you keep steadily in mind the idea that, of course, there are functions that you can't seriously contemplate being contracted out, Auditor General being one of them, then why wouldn't we say, of the huge variety of things that are contracted out, that there is both an expediency, that is usually a financial or efficiency consideration, or there is sometimes a content. I don't want an Australian government building company, so I'm happy to contract out bricklaying. But I would love, and here's a suggestion for one last giant consultancy contract, I would love someone actually to examine, have the taxpayers actually saved any money by the contracting out to so-called consultants of things that used to be done in-house by people who were both proud to be in and content to stay in the public service? I'm willing to bet, confident I think that no one will ever put this to the test, but also because this is what I think is true, I'm willing to bet we haven't saved $1. And if we haven't saved $1, why are we doing it?
Thank you. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you, panelists and audience members, for a great discussion. Obviously, it's a can of worms and we've only scratched the surface, but we're having another webinar on the 22nd next week looking at secrecy of government information, and we're joined by Kate McClymont, who's an investigative journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald, and Anne Toomey, who's a professor at the University of Sydney, who's going to be looking at the archives. So a useful discussion to continue looking at some of the issues we've unpacked today. You can also sign up to the Centre for Public Integrity's email list, our Twitter and our social media to find out more resources, research and events on this matter. Thank you all for coming, and a big thanks to Mike and Bret for giving us some of their valuable time today. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.